Well, thank you so much for joining. This is absolutely amazing. I've seen some people putting in the chat like greetings and where they're joining us from. And if you guys want to keep doing that, it's really interesting and it's kind of amazing this new world we're in with opening up to these kind of programs to people all over. So I really appreciate you joining us. I am here in Stillwater, Minnesota, and thanks to the Stillwater Library for hosting this great series of programs. Again, I'm so heartened that so many people are this interested in birds to join us tonight. So I'll be getting help from Jody and Aurora to manage your questions and the chat functions, but we'll just jump into it. So by way of introduction, my name is Joanna Eckles, and birds really have been a thing for me since I was a little kid. I was amazed by birds starting in elementary school, and they've really been a central and organizing force in my life ever since. I can manage to bring birds into just about everything. So it's kind of a sickness, I guess. But I am really fortunate too to have been able to find work with birds or on behalf of birds my entire adult life. So that's been great. And right now I am serving, hang on, let me see if this will advance for us. There we go. So currently I'm serving as curator of birds at the Raptor Center here in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota, where I am responsible for the care and management and training of the education birds. Those are the ones that live with us permanently as education ambassadors, and they're really integral to our education mission. And if you want to meet any of these amazing birds, you can check out our digital offerings. We're just getting them off the ground. You can join us for a public program tomorrow, where we're going to get up and close and personal with a kestrel. Or you can invite a bird to a meeting or to a work meeting, maybe to lighten the mood, or surprise your book club or your family, or maybe your happy hour group. So you'll have to join us to find out what all these guys are. But throughout the presentation, I've got a lot of images of birds. And I have tried, they're all native, first of all found here in Minnesota, at least in the upper Midwest. And I've tried to label them all, maybe all but the last few that I hastily added will be labeled. So look for that if you're wondering what kinds of birds they are. And then a quick shout out to my parents who are on the line here. My interest in birds really was very natural, I think, but they really jumped on board and facilitated that and ended up focusing a lot of their interests on birds as well. And they pioneered a lot of the bird-friendly actions that I'll be talking about today. So hello, they're in Rochester, New York. So what are we going to talk about? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of give you food for thought about how to make choices in your life on your property. And maybe if you're in charge of property, maybe you work in a municipality or something, but make choices that can support birds, because really birds are just an indicator, and when they're doing well, we are doing well. So the things that we do for birds will benefit all creatures, including humans. So we'll talk first about why focus on birds. I'll give you tips in kind of two main categories about habitat and about threats. Improving habitat, reducing threats. Talk a little bit about how to get involved, and then we'll spend some time on your questions because we got literally maybe 100 questions. And one thing too before we start, if you were on the birding talk last week, it's something that I emphasized there too. It's really amazing how many people are on this call and who are interested in this subject, and everybody has different experiences and reasons for being here. For some of you, the things I'll talk about will be elementary. You'll know a lot of them maybe, but for others, it may be a lot of new information. So my advice is to, with all of it, is sort of to adopt a learning mindset. Start where you are. You're right on time. You're just where you're supposed to be. So just listen with curiosity and find something that's new to you and places that you might start in all of these areas we discuss. So why birds? It turns out that birds are a pretty compelling lens through which we can look at our world. And there's a lot of compelling reasons to be bird friendly at home and in our communities. And birds themselves, of course, are stunning and interesting and beautiful, as are the habitat that they live in. They represent diversity in an ecosystem, and they provide invaluable what we call ecosystem services. Those are things that are of service to people, very ecocentric as we are sometimes, but things like pollination and seed dispersal, insect control, things that we would pay a whole lot of money if we could even pay money to do them. So birds serve a lot of those functions. They're hugely important to tourism. Birding is a $41 billion industry in this country, which is just amazing. And really our actions to support birds and their habitats improve that ability for people to come look at them. Also, the things that we do can save time and money in terms of the things we plant. Birds and birding connect families, they connect communities, and birds are good for you. So it's proven that time spent outdoors in nature reduces stress, increases happiness. It also contributes physically to your health in terms of reducing tension and blood pressure and even stress hormones in your body. So that's been proven. So there you go. So how do we get more of all of that? Basically, again, it's these two things. We increase habitat and we reduce threats. So let's talk about those things. So when we talk about habitat, I think about habitat as anywhere and everywhere possible, we need to create habitat. So by far, I'll talk about threats, but by far the biggest threat facing wildlife of all kinds is habitat destruction, fragmentation, and alteration. It's the most serious problem worldwide facing wildlife. So when I really mean it when I say anywhere and everywhere possible. And really it's kind of economies of scale. There's practical decisions that we can make, but really the bottom line is no parcel is too small to make a difference. And a key resource that I've come to rely on recent years is kind of an unassuming entomologist named Doug Tallamy, where this quote comes from. His books, which I'll show you afterwards, are called Bringing Nature Home, and his newest one is called Nature's Best Hope. And he's also does speaking engagements all over the world, really. And he's become a real rallying cry, and his motto is, and the subtitle of his newest book is A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard. So I'll talk more about some of his messages related to native plants, and I'll also just kind of share with you some of the personal major aha moments I've had in listening to him and reading his stuff. So, but first, in keeping with this idea of how small, no piece is too small or too large, let's talk a little bit about the anywhere and everywhere idea. Where can we find some of this land that is ripe for creating habitat? And typically you don't have to look too far to find land that could make amazing habitat. So when people ask me what they can do, the first place I start, if they have a yard, is here. And there's a couple of approaches to making habitat out of yards. So let's first talk about mowing. So I like to think if every person, all of us, just say all of us, even on this call, reduced the amount we mowed by just 10%, imagine cumulatively how that would begin to add up. So lawns not only provide virtually no habitat value for birds and other animals and wildlife, but there's so much maintenance involved, potentially with chemicals, herbicides, and pesticides. There's CO2 emissions as well as noise pollution. All those things really affect the quality and health of our communities. And in the United States alone, there are nearly 50 million acres of lawn. So really changing this paradigm is critical to the future of wildlife. And proportionally, our love of the lawn kind of breaks down like this. It's a whole lot of lawn, a fair amount of impervious surfaces. So that's the stuff that water runs off of, the driveway, your house, the walkway. There's a tiny bit of it that's dedicated to vegetable gardening, more and more all the time. And then a sprinkling of kind of trees, flowers, shrubs. This is kind of a familiar sight across the United States wherever you live, and it's increasing in size all the time. So most of this lawn area and a lot of the habitat we create in our yards is just not very useful to birds or wildlife. So the lawn is a good place to start. And on the theme of starting where you are, I'm going to try to give you like ideas about the very minimum place to start, because sometimes when I use some of the examples of sort of more elaborate actions, it might feel daunting. So always just some place to start. So if mowing less isn't something you're ready for, or you need to make some negotiations to make that happen in your household, consider at least removing chemical inputs from your lawn and letting it diversify kind of naturally. So we need to get back to a place where it isn't just like accepted that there are some times when people and pets can't be on lawns. So when our kids were little, we sort of said, when you see that little sign that says nobody can be on that lawn, that's not a place to play. When you see clover and dandelions, that's a good place to play. So we need to like change our mindset. I'm not embarrassed to say, this is what I call lawn. This is our front lawn. A photo taken this morning, right after that downpour that came through here. And it's actually kind of fun for me to look at this and see how many different things I can find in the lawn. And I especially like the moss that's found its way in. So that's what our lawn looks up close up. This is what it looks like going down between some of the big patches of native habitat that we have. So changing our view of what lawn equals would just be in and of itself a huge boon for wildlife of all kinds, from pollinators through birds and mammals. Another place that we can tap into creating habitat is along boulevards. So 17 years ago, in 2003, my neighborhood here in Stillwater, Minnesota, we got a grant from our DNR, Department of Natural Resources. Unfortunately, the program we got that through is not funded anymore, but it was called Neighborhood Wilds. And the whole idea of it was about working with your neighbors across property lines to create habitat. So the next few images show some of these boulevards at different times during the year. And I have this vision that someday communities will have like a master habitat plan, much like we now have master trail plans. So now communities all, I think, have a master trail plan so that when they're doing road work or road construction, they know where they need a new trail segment. I'd like us to be looking at habitat in our municipalities like that too, so that every time there's work being done somewhere, we can look for ways of linking up habitat, and boulevards are a way to do that. I have watched animals walk through my yard, through our habitat, cross the sidewalk, walk down the boulevard, cross the street, and walk into another prairie segment. So these can truly be corridors. And I've watched hummingbirds come right down the row on the boulevard, feeding from there and going back and forth to people's hanging plants on their porches. So boulevards are really one potential example. So let me show you some fun pictures. This is different times of year. This is a picture taken last summer, a little later than now. Also this one, taken a little later than right now. This one was taken just like 2 days ago. So those coneflowers are beginning to open. And what we did, let me just go back one here. So our neighborhood, we got $15,000 in funding in 2003, and we planted hundreds of native plants from plugs, so from little baby plants. And we also seeded a buffer along the back of the properties. And big, huge sections of this are still thriving 14 years later. And when they contain like this huge variety of plants that attract so many interesting creatures. And I remember when I was like toiling over the plant list for our order way back then. And somebody asked me, aren't you really limited by the plants when you use natives? And I think it just couldn't be further from the truth. It's like the opposite to me. When you go into a classic gardening store, you're limited to the same small set of plants. Whereas when you tap into natives, there's just such a huge variety. Just in this small section, there's probably 25 different species. And as you stop and look at it, more and more will become visible, and they're blooming throughout the entire year. So it's really been amazing. And all these years later, they're still connecting us as neighbors. This is the steward, Jan, of this section in front of her house. And this was just this morning when we stopped to chat about all that was coming up. And we do this quite frequently, and it's kept us really close as a neighborhood. So that's been super, super fun. A variation on the boulevard theme is to create rain gardens, sort of formally or informally. And by that, I mean, this one's a formal rain garden where the city has actually adjusted the curb so that the water runs first into the rain garden and secondarily into the gutter. But rain gardens give runoff a bit of a kind of a pre-treatment before it heads down the storm drain or through the groundwater, really, because it doesn't ever get to the storm drain unless it's a real heavy rainfall. But by doing that, it really protects water quality overall, and they're incredibly valuable, adding beauty and wildlife habitat where in many cases there was formerly sod. Another place to create habitat is along wetland buffers. In many parts of the country, this is the law. It doesn't mean it always happens. But similar to rain gardens, wetland buffers, kind of like the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the sediments that will be running off land in a storm event. And it protects and restores the water quality. It helps these ponds kind of function more naturally. And it really helps the aquatic habitat that lives there, plants and animals that live in the habitat. And I actually took this image a couple years ago, and it actually was, I took it as an example of where mowing was coming too close to a pond. But what's really cool is that now, just this morning, this is what it looks like. And this is what it should look like. So this is an example of just not mowing. So that sort of 10% if we just didn't mow so much. So it's not a restoration per se, not even super quality plants here, but it's not mowed. And at that, it provides much better habitat and function than if it were mowed. So that's kind of the first step is in habitat is first, just let it do what it would do naturally, even if you're going to mow it. Second, stop mowing it and let it do what it's going to do naturally. So a little longer if you can. And then I'll give you some examples of like a full-blown restoration as well. Okay, so before we leave the topic of mowing, it's good to mention alternatives to traditional turf. So this is our backyard, and it's an example of what you might have heard of as no-mow or eco-grass. And it's a mix of specific kinds of grasses that do most of their growing early in the springtime. So this will get about, I don't know, not quite knee-high in the spring, in May, and we'll set our mower at its highest settings and we'll mow it once in May when the seeds are ripe, and outside of a few spot trimmings, that's it until the next year. So it's beautiful and it's soft and it's quite weed resistant. And this is something that has been getting more and more interest. I've had more and more people ask us to come see ours, for example. And I had this and wanted to show you an example of it in use by a municipality. This, which is something that you could encourage as a citizen. This example is from Iowa. And it's along with eco-grass from Prairie Moon Nursery, installed along prairie borders, along the trail shoulders. And Prairie Moon actually sent me these images in exchange for the previous one of our yard, which is actually in their catalog sometimes. not always, super fun. But this type of turf needs very little input. Like I said, mowing once and a little trimming, no water, no fertilizer. And it's very tough and hardly ever any weed seeds seem to get in there. I want to finish this section with another sort of turf to habitat example, hopefully an inspiring one to you. So this is what I'm going to show you is a brand new Lawns to Legumes project. That's a program, grant program through our Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, something we call Bowser is the nickname. And it's really heartening to see this as part of a nationwide movement to become less lawn focused and to return properties to more natural state. So homeowners that get grants from the Lawns to Legumes program, they kind of make a pact to use native plants. They pledge not to use chemicals, and in turn they create this critical habitat for wildlife. And the homeowner is my friend and master naturalist and all-around super effective champion for all living things, who is also on this call, Dana. And she said that by next year, the native sedges in the front yard, which were planted just earlier this month, they're going to fill in, and they're going to require no mowing, no chemical treatments, and no water or less water than what was previously sod. Also, as a bonus, the yard also qualifies for National Wildlife Federation's Certified Wildlife Habitat. So another hopefully inspiring example of creating habitat in that anywhere and everywhere, and reducing lawn area and maintenance, all for the good. So that's kind of the big habitat section. Next, creating habitat section. The next thing we're going to talk about is natives and invasive. I'm actually not going to talk that much about removing invasive species, but planting natives, the other side of the coin is removing invasives, and those are going to be specific to your area and your property. So I'm going to focus most of the attention on planting natives. So when we find these habitats to create, what do we plant? So many people are well versed in the benefits of native plants, but in a nutshell, native plants, once they're established, like we've said, require very little maintenance, less inputs, and reduced mowing. And the reason natives are so beneficial to wildlife is not only because they produce food outright, like these berry trees, but perhaps it's more important their role in providing food for insects. And I'll tell you why that's important. Because native insects, especially caterpillars and of butterflies and moths, they are what birds need. So native plants create food for native insects, and that creates food for native birds. It's a rather simple equation, really. Insects are the key to this puzzle. E.O. Wilson has a famous quote that says, "Insects are the little things that run the world. We may not notice them very much, but we would really notice them if they were gone." And virtually the important kind of message in terms of birds is that virtually all birds feed their young insects. So they have to be able to find them and find lots of them and find them fast. And since native plants and insects co-evolved over millions of years, that's where insects are found. They simply don't eat the alien plants that sometimes dominate our urban and suburban landscapes. So they just can't be found there. So the best image I can give you is one that I will take straight from Doug Tallamy. It kind of hit me like a ton of bricks the first time I heard him say this, but he likened it to this vision of fake plants versus bird feeders. So if you plant a native plant, you have planted a bird feeder. If you plant an exotic plant, it might as well be a fake plant, say like a plastic plant from a hobby store. Without the native plants, you won't have the insects, and without the insects, you won't have the birds. So to drive the point home, we'll look at the chickadee. So Tallamy documented through his research, again, he's an entomologist. If I didn't say this before, he's an entomologist from the University of Delaware. And so his focus is insects, but he has made the critical connection for everybody in terms of that insect to bird connection. So through his research, he found that it takes, are you ready? Oops, sorry, it takes 5,000 to 10,000 caterpillars to raise just one brood of chickadees. So we, and maybe you, have chickadees nesting in our front yard, and last year they produced at least 2 broods, I think maybe 3 broods. And they could do that, I think, because they had what they needed within very short flights in every direction. So that's how critical it is. So when a chickadee is deciding where to live, to set up shop, it matters, right? It matters what the plants are. And to kind of better illustrate what a difference your choices make, we can look at plants. We can look at trees and other plants, and we can look at how many caterpillars they support as an indicator of their value to wildlife. So if you look at native oak species, so white oak, or bur oak, red oak, black oak, but the native oaks produce or support hundreds of species of caterpillars, whereas something like, and this is just an example, ginkgos are beautiful, but they just didn't evolve with our native insects, so they just really don't support many. And I always think that maybe those 4 species of caterpillar on the ginkgo were just really trying to find their way to an oak. So, so really, when you're a chickadee in search of thousands of caterpillars, this is a really critical difference. And as we close that kind of conversation, it's good to recognize that what we do for birds is also invaluable to pollinators and vice versa. So many pollinators, as we know, are in serious decline. There's excellent work being done for pollinators right here in our town. A group called the Pollinator Friendly Alliance started here, and the head of that group did a talk in this same series just last month. And it's super exciting to see how the issues facing pollinators have really galvanized interest, helping to focus policy and attention on native habitat. So good things all around. I'm excited that people are excited about pollinators. So next tip about creating habitat is about forests. So we tend to think of natives as flowering plants and grasses, but of course our tree choices are very important too. So it's about the trees a community selects like for its own use and promotes to its citizens, and not just about the trees, but really the whole forest. So the species that are selected, but also there's sort of what we call structural diversity, like how, the combination of trees and shrubs and evergreens versus deciduous trees, flowering versus shrubs and things like that. But we're also looking at things like their climate resiliency. This is something we've really got to think of for the future for birds, and as well as their food, the food they produce for birds and wildlife, and shade and beauty and cost and hardiness. So all of these things go into good forest management. And going back to that discussion about trees, there are actually lists that we can reference when looking for what tree to plant. And this list comes out of Doug Tallamy's first major book, Bringing Nature Home. This was just the ones I could fit at the top of the list. But it really shows, again, that figure for oaks, but then down the line, the numbers of caterpillar species that different trees support. And then another great reference that was produced by our Wild Ones group here in Minnesota is this little book about attracting birds with native plants. And this also goes through all the different types of plants, many different types of plants, and examples of how many caterpillar species as a sort of a metric for their value. So another thing to think of with forest management is snags or dead trees. So leaving dead trees standing whenever you can, when they're not a hazard, or if you're so inclined, selectively killing trees on purpose to let them standing. So again, I am the guinea pig. This is our backyard, and this is a tree that we killed in a long line that we kind of inherited We girdled the first one, and it became the most amazing magnet for every kind of bird. There were times when there were 8 different species of birds at once in this tree. That one lasted for many years until it finally slowly listed over, and we had to lay it down to create habitat in the horizontal position. And we have now killed, I think, 3 more down that line, and we're just waiting for them to kind of do their magic. So this is a red-shouldered hawk that came and visited that tree, the same branch in that tree, repeatedly over the course of 1 year. So super fun. Snags also produce critical food and habitat for a huge variety of birds and mammals. Many of the woodpeckers get things started with their holes, and then other birds and animals take over the holes as they've been vacated by woodpeckers. And some birds are obligate cavity nesters, which means that's the only place that they nest. Examples, sorry, it's starting to rain here. Examples of that are things like bluebirds, and for a raptor example, the American kestrel is a obligate cavity nester. So woodpeckers get things started, and but even before that, the dead trees left standing are super important. And a little maintenance note when we're talking about trees is pruning is really an important thing to know about. So thinking about the life cycle of a bird, birds are mostly breeding in the spring, and their young are in trees, often in nests. And so if you can do anything possible to do no pruning, at least till July, preferably till August, you are going to do such a favor to birds that are trying to nest in the trees on your property. So delay pruning. And next, to talk about water. Clean water is, of course, critical to everything, all life on Earth. You can contribute by the way you plant your plants, which we've learned affects how the water runs off your property and into our waterways and groundwater. Also, you can create a backyard pond or a bird bath. But I use the trumpeter swan here as an example because they, of course, depend on water. But I put this caveat of natural waterways to kind of indicate how important it is that we, wherever possible, let water do what water needs to do. And the reason I'll use them as an example is because trumpeter swans are kind of like ground feeders, and they depend on certain roots under the water. And so what happens is when the water just goes to its natural low water level, say a pond or a river, then one of their favorite plants was just called the arrowhead, which I have a picture in the next slide of it. It's a very beautiful plant. It creates these huge beds of like tubers or like sprouts that are a critical food source for swans on migration. So the cygnets, which are the little babies, the chicks, they start out their life eating aquatic insects, which are, as we've learned, they're a high source of protein, which is why birds need to feed them to their young. But by about 5 weeks, they're eating mostly vegetation and roots. So the plants in the water and the health of them are super, super important. So that's our nod to clean water in all the ways that we can help provide it. And here is this beautiful picture of arrowhead on a beautiful misty morning, of all places on a golf course. So can grow in many places, I guess. Okay, so the first place to look when thinking about nesting opportunities, we've already discussed. It's things like the management of the forest and the trees, the understory, but even grasslands, which I will talk about also in a minute. So that overall habitat is the source of most nesting. So that's where we should focus our efforts on what we plant and provide for birds in terms of plants and habitat. But there are also ways that we can enhance nesting by providing artificial structures like boxes and platforms. And I've shown here classic, like what we would call bluebird nest boxes, but that are also used by other species. This is shown a bluebird on one and a tree swallow on the other, which is a lot of times what happens when you put boxes out. But this is a great way to get involved. It's really important that when planning for boxes, to put boxes up, that you really think about the maintenance and the monitoring. So it's a good idea to have a plan lined up before installing any boxes, but it can be a really fun way to learn the birds in your area and get kind of a relationship with some of them and serve a purpose for them. I had to include this. It's not something most people could put in their yard, but municipalities can put up nesting platforms for birds like osprey. You got to include a few birds of prey. I got a chance to go up in a bucket truck when ospreys were being banded, and I got this once in a lifetime chance to take this amazing photo. And I think it just shows super interesting view of their habitat and the super exposed way that they sometimes nest. So that's kind of fun. So before I close this section on whatever we're on, which is nesting opportunities, I want to just mention about grass or ground nesting birds. So a lot of people think of nests of birds as in trees and shrubs, but a huge number of our grassland birds, most of our grassland birds nest on the ground, including birds like this northern harrier, which is a kind of amazing and somewhat more obscure bird of prey that's native to Minnesota. And these species are especially vulnerable in so many ways. First of all, grasslands are our most critical habitat, critically endangered habitat. And so that puts grassland nesting species in this category, sadly, of among the most threatened. So something you can do for them is also delaying mowing if you're in a position to manage a grassland of any kind, either on your own property or in your municipality. So delay mowing. This is an example of a ground nest. It's actually a European species, so I guess it's not a native, but it was the best free image I could find of what a ground nest looks like. And I've been fortunate to find a couple of these. Oh, I should have taken a picture of one of those on grassland surveys. So they're amazingly camouflaged. And again, practical advice is really the same here. So waiting until July or even August is premier. There's higher survival rates of some of these really iconic grassland species, like this is a bobolink who requires grasslands to nest. Okay, so shifting from habitat, we're going to jump into threats to birds. Let me just get a look at the time. Okay, so reducing threats anywhere and everywhere possible. So like I said earlier, habitat loss is the greatest cause of wildlife decline. And there are also a lot of things that humans do to harm birds, but we're not going to be, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about them and we're going to talk about solutions because it can get kind of down. The only ones I'm going to talk about here are cats, I'll talk about buildings, and I'll talk about toxins. But this is the general order of magnitude that we consider these threats from highest to lowest. So you can't talk about bird conservation without talking about cats. I start with this photo of my own cat. I love cats. I think they're amazing pets, but I am a cats indoors evangelist, if you will. Free roaming cats, whether they have owners or don't have owners, are really a devastating problem for birds and mammals. It can be a super contentious issue, but it's not really debatable. Cats kill literally billions of birds in the US and Canada every year. So cats indoors is just a good policy, and it's really safer for cats too. So outdoor cats live shorter, more unpleasant lives. There's so many perils outside. Most outdoor cats are affected by one or more of these. So on average, cats that are allowed outdoors live less. They don't live very long. And ones kept indoors can live to 18 or 20 years old. So far from being anti-cat, most bird enthusiasts have cats. Many have cats as a key part of their household. but keeping them inside is good for the cat and also good for birds and wildlife. So that's all that we need to say about that, except the fun thing about looking at some of the amazing things people are doing to keep their cats happy. So there is a thing, it's called a catio. It is a patio, but for a cat. And there's all kinds of amazing ways people have built these as extensions of their home or with tunnels and things like that. We personally put our cat on a leash when he goes out. He doesn't love that, but that's his trade-off for 3 square meals a day and a bed to sleep in, so, and to keep him in safe. Good to mention dogs too, especially in relation to that ground nesting bird images I showed. If you have a place where you can run a dog free, that is probably fine if it's okay in the location, but I would avoid doing it in those times we know birds are going to be breeding because of ground nesting birds. Next, we'll talk about windows. I promise this is the one and only dead bird image in my presentation. Bird window collisions were a major focus of my career for well over a decade. I headed up a 10-year study in Minneapolis, St. Paul about bird window collisions, and I also coordinated the work that many of you are aware of regarding the stadium, including the study design for a 2-year study that took place there. So we can talk about that maybe separately, but I think the point here is that bird window collisions are a leading cause of bird mortality, and they are preventable. So this is a pretty much completely preventable problem. So if you're dealing with it at home, basically the primary causes are reflection. So when birds see habitat reflected in glass, and transparency. So when they can see through glass and want to get to what's on the other side. And then there's light pollution plays a role too, which I will talk about those 2 things separately. I do have to take a moment and close my window. So give me a sec here. It's raining here in Minnesota. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so I said this is a preventable problem, and how we prevent it, there's solutions really are in 2 categories: by reducing hazards from glass and then also reducing light pollution. So solutions, if you're having problems at your windows, the great thing about homes, I've dealt with a lot of huge corporate buildings, and those are there are solutions, but they're much harder than our homes. At our homes, we're usually dealing with just a couple of places. So the first thing to do is, if you're having problems at your home, identify the places that are a problem, just focus your energy there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through how I've found the easiest way to describe solutions. And this background image is actually from a display we have up at the Raptor Center, which talks in depth about this and many other problems. But the solutions for windows basically fall in what I would call, divide into 3 categories. And I'm going to give you examples of each of these. Basically, you put something on the surface of the window that serves it to say, stop, don't come here. You put something in front of the glass that serves that same purpose, stop, don't come here. Or you put some kind of a physical barrier in front of the glass that physically stops birds from hitting it. And I'm going to give you examples of all of these. So for a visual barrier on the surface, this is an example of the front entrance of the Raptor Center. This is when they were installing the film that we designed, custom designed film that we designed to put on our windows at the Raptor Center to be a demonstration for what people can do. You could get a film like this for your home, something like this or similar. And for your home, there are other things available. So you can there's all kinds of ways that you can solve this, from tapes to decals. And the important thing is their spacing. So you got to put kind of a lot of them on there, because birds are able to fly through tiny, tiny spaces. So if you put one silhouette on a big window, then a bird will just zoom around that silhouette and hit the glass adjacent to it, if you know what I mean. An example, this is not in front of the glass, it's kind of behind the glass. And a lot of people don't think that this is really a good suggestion to look at blinds, because blinds are on the inside. And oftentimes you can have reflection on the outside, but I've seen many cases where this can be helpful, interior blinds on a building. When what I would always suggest people do is just have a look at their building from the outside or their windows, and make sure that in all different lighting that can be seen from the outside and you're not instead seeing a reflection. Oh, the other little note is the cat indoor there. Had to note. A visual barrier in front of the glass is like these strings. So this is our upstairs window in our house, and these are strings that hang at certain intervals in front of the glass. That is 100% effective in our experience at stopping collisions. Easy to make, inexpensive. Creative solutions abound. An example of a physical barrier in front of a glass is well known to everybody, a window screen. So one of the simplest things you can do if you're building new or redoing your windows is to get external screens. External screens create both a visual barrier and a physical barrier. You can also add them after the fact. This is a homeowner I worked with that was having collisions on their porch, and we installed screening in front of the window so that she could still operate her windows, and her bird collisions have stopped. Another example I like to show, especially for people who have summer homes that aren't in use a lot of the year, is some kind of physical barrier like a shade that you can literally draw when you're not there. That helps protect your belongings, and it also helps keep that building not from harming birds when you're not even there. And I'm going a little faster because I want to leave time for questions. So I want to talk quickly about light pollution. This is what North America now looks like at night. There's really no natural darkness east of the Mississippi River. So, and I guess the important thing with light pollution is that at the most basic level, every living thing, including us, relies on that natural rhythm of light and dark for our health. And I think that this is an issue that's just kind of crept up on us slowly, and it's getting worse and we don't even notice it. So the beauty of it is that this is an easy one, should be an easy one for individuals. It's literally the flip of a switch. So you can start at home by reducing your own lighting. So this is an example of a classic yard light. You can change these lights to be motion detecting, or you can change them to have what we call a full cutoff so that the light points down, or you can turn them off. Whoa, sorry, I jumped from large thunder here. Down shielding is another thing. This is our front porch before, and this is after. This is something you can do easily at your home. Generally, if I go back, generally if light is glaring in your eyes or pointing up, it's light pollution. It's not pointed where we need it. So look around your neighborhood, look around your yard. Anything that's glaring in your eyes is light pollution. So how we did this was, there's two ways you can accomplish this very easily. One, you can buy a fixture and just look up dark sky porch light. And this was the examples I got. These are all down shielded. We didn't actually change out our fixtures. All we did was we changed out the bulbs. So there are full cutoff or down shielded bulbs you can buy, and that's a solved problem right there. Lastly, not quite lastly, but almost lastly, I'm gonna close with toxins. So as humans, we introduce a lot of toxins into the environment. This too can be relatively easily solved with education. Best intentioned people sometimes just don't realize that maybe they have a contract for rodent control and they don't realize that some of those chemicals can be harmful. So if you have what you perceive as a rodent problem, consider the use of like an old-fashioned snap trap. Instead of chemical, what we call rodenticides, they can cause secondary poisoning in a lot of different birds and animals. And herbicides and pesticides are important to reduce, especially things like neonicotinoids that are systemic and show up in all parts of the plant. Eliminating or reducing those will keep more insects available for birds to feed their babies. And I'd be remiss in not mentioning lead in hunting ammunition and fishing tackle. Because of its toxicity, we've removed lead from so many things in our environment, yet it's still used in hunting. So The dangers are probably best publicized in birds like bald eagles and trumpeter swans and scavengers like vultures. I guess the important thing to know here is if you are a hunter or have hunters in your life, just start by making sure that this is an issue that they're aware of and that they know that there are safe options. And that's probably the important thing to note here. But so many of the bald eagles and vultures that we see at the Raptor Center show exposure to lead. So it's a pervasive thing in the environment that we are really working to get rid of. And that was a nod to the bottom feeders. This is where sometimes swans are picking up lead, is on the bottom where waterfowl have been hunted. Okay, so this is what we talked about. We have a few minutes left. So we talked about creating habitat, reducing lawn area, planting natives. We talked about forests and forest management and water and nesting opportunities. We talked about threats from pets and windows and light pollution and pest control and ways that you can take first steps in mitigating some of those. And so the last piece is you. So get outside and get involved. There's so many ways that you can turn your own property into like a citizen science laboratory, making your sightings available to the larger scientific community, and adding so much more enjoyment and knowledge for your own self and for the world. So that, my friends, is what we might say is the end. So I will take questions. I left a few minutes and I appreciate your attention over that long, many slides.
All right. The first question, I've got someone asked about starting the Boulevard Gardens. It's kind of a daunting project if you don't have any experience. What would be a way to get started with that sort of Boulevard Garden?
Okay, so the thing to do is to not take the whole boulevard at first. So here's what you can do. Let me close out of my show. Well, no, I didn't pull one up. There are pre-planned packages of plants. This is what I would recommend you do. Look for, depending on what you want, you decide, pollinators, birds, both. Look for a mix of plants for ready-made and planned for pollinators or birds. And you can buy them and they will have a plan and they will have the area. And so then all you have to do is start with that small area and start there. And then you can add on, whereas instead of killing the whole thing and then being like overwhelmed, then you can always add more, right? Every season you can collect your own seeds if you get into that, or you can just buy another set of plugs later. So that's how I would suggest starting there. Another way to start in your own gardens is just one at a time as you're planting new plants. Don't tear everything out, just one at a time. Add a native, add a native, add a native. Pretty soon, if you do that, 2 a year, it will add up so fast because the time flies. So there's that. I hope that's helpful.
We also got a lot of questions about feeders, and I know that that was a little different than the talk here, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. So feeders, bird feeding is an amazing entree into birds and birding. And so I would recommend bird feeding. And there's a lot of myths about bird feeding, like I can't stop bird feeding because they'll rely on it. The thing to know is that birds were here before us. They know where food is. They are using your feeders as a supplement. Sometimes it's really important supplement in certain conditions, like say in the spring, if you have a hummingbird feeder out, hummingbirds come back and it's really cold or something, can be really important. But in general, they're using it as a supplement. So you can, for example, say just feed in the winter. Oh, another feeding thing I should mention is if you do have natives, leave them up, leave them standing in the winter and in the spring. That helps pollinators who are nesting in the stems, but it also helps birds who are eating the seeds. So that's a little point I didn't end up making. But feeding birds in the winter can be super fun. It helps you if you're learning birding too, because we have a smaller subset of birds that live in any place pretty much in the winter. So you begin by learning those ones that come to your feeders. What I would start with is I would start with a black oil sunflower feeder. That's the most commonly used seed. A water source, especially in the winter, is super attractive. So you can get these baths that have heat, not much heat. It's not like a sauna or not like a whirlpool, but like a little heat so it doesn't freeze. Then you can begin adding, like add one more feeder, add like a peanut feeder in the winter, add a thistle feeder, which is the little black seeds. I add sunflower to that. So you can just like start with one, again, start where you are, start with one, add another, add another, add another. Pretty soon we have like 8, I think. And then the other thing I'd recommend in terms of citizen science is there's a program called Feeder Watch. And Feeder Watch is a citizen science program where you count the birds in a systematic way that are coming to your feeders. And it is so fun and helps you learn. So there's way more, I'm sure, about feeding, but that's a little bit.
One of the questions that I thought was interesting, you talked about cats as predators. There were a couple of questions about bears specifically and getting into bird feeders or keeping them out of bird nests.
Yes. So bears, we do have bears in our neighborhood. We have had bears in our yard. We have had bears completely destroy our feeders once. Generally, so if you're in a place where bears are a real issue, you may have to feed birds using plants, not using feeders, or create something bear proof. And I do have a friend who's in bear country who's also a huge birder, and he's got these like these telephone poles literally, and a pulley system where all of his feeders raise and lower. So if you're handy or can hire somebody handy, getting them pulled up out of reach is the way to protect feeders from bears and deer, which I think was another question. So very good ones.
And then we had a question about climate change or decline in number of birds migrating. Do you have any anything to add to any of those topics?
Okay, so yeah, both of those topics. So the topics were climate change and how it's affecting birds, and migration this year, I think was the question. This spring was a really odd migration, and we just never got the peaks of birds that we often see, like in the month of May, which is like my favorite month of the year. I probably birdwatch every day in May, multiple times a day. Sometimes that just happens. Conditions are changeable, and sometimes birds have favorable conditions for just passing over. So they rely really on a lot of environmental, like wind speeds and directions, and they just move when they can move, and they're grounded when they're grounded. And sometimes we get to enjoy them while they're on stopover, which is why this habitat is super important even to migrants, because they need it to fuel up for migration. So this spring, if you were seeing less, I don't know that it's an indicator of like catastrophe. More, it's, I think, a normal seasonal variation. And in terms of climate change, absolutely we are seeing changes. And some of the observations I was talking about, the citizen science observations, are where this information is coming from. So years and years of information about when birds are first arriving or where they're showing up is showing us both phenologically, that is the timing, so when things happen. Phenology is changing. This can be critical because, say, a hummingbird relies on a certain plant. That plant, if it opens 2 weeks earlier than the hummingbird arrives, that can be a problem. So yes, we're learning that the more we can plant to create resiliency is important. The other thing we're learning is that birds are shifting their ranges. And sometimes they've shifted their ranges, but habitat doesn't exist where climate has pushed them, if that makes sense. So both important problems that perfectly wrap us up to say, how important the diversity of plants you provide is in climate resiliency for all of these kinds of creatures. So, is that a good place to stop?
Sure. Although I'll add that we've got
Yeah.
a couple questions here about which birds were at different slides. We will share
Oh, sure.
a little later, and so people can.
Well, I could say, because I will stay. You can, I will stay as long as you will talk. I'm being respectful of those who want to sign off at 7:30 or whatever time it is where you are.
So there was a question about the bird in the beginning of the presentation, although it doesn't specify, and then the bird with the black beak in the nest at the beginning. So.
Okay, this one? Yes, this is, I hope this is what they meant, the first one. This is a northern flicker, believe it or not, a kind of woodpecker that lives here. Amazing. So yeah, so this is an interesting woodpecker because it doesn't act like a typical woodpecker that's going up the side of a tree. It forages on the ground a lot. So but you can see its enormous beak puts it, for many reasons, it's in the woodpecker family. But that's a northern flicker. Males and females are slightly different. The males have a mustache, so this is a male, and the female doesn't have that black mustache. And then, I'm sorry, Aurora, what was the other one about a black beak?
In a nest, so.
Oh, I didn't label that one because I put that one in like seconds before you got on. I'm gonna show it to you. Hang on. It was a kingbird, I think, this one. Yeah, so this is a kingbird, which is a large flycatcher. And this was a kingbird I found on a nest when I was doing bird surveys out in western Minnesota, but they are a bird that is here in, well, I don't know where everybody is, but there's eastern kingbirds and western kingbirds, and we have the eastern here. So beautiful little guy. Sorry I didn't label that one. You caught me.
So the other thing I would say too is that we've had a couple questions about identifying birds and best time for bird watching specifically came in the comments. And we did have a presentation about bird watching last week that I think we're going to send out.
Yes, that'd be great. Just include that. And I'll tell you about, okay, so what I recommend generally if you're just getting into learning birding, I mean, watch it anytime, but a good time to start is literally in the winter time or in the summertime, just not in the spring or fall. I mean, sure, watch them in the spring or fall, but to really focus your learning, we have more sort of stable populations on a day-to-day basis in the winter, in the summer. Summer, you'll have breeding birds, you'll have many more, but they're normally singing, they're brightly colored. But the winter is really a great place to just nail down all those resident winter birds. And then when spring and summer come, you can add on those summer breeding birds that come from all kinds of places to be here to breed in the summer. So the life cycle is basically, if you're a migrating bird, you are on a wintering ground, which is sometimes far, far from here. You're on a breeding ground, which many birds breed here in northern Minnesota and Canada. And then you have migration in between. So you're either going north or you're going south, or you're breeding or you're wintering. That's the general life cycle. And wintering is the smallest numbers of birds live in Minnesota in the winter. That helps.
All right, and then we got a specific question about what the average lifespan of birds is.
Oh, yeah, good question. So it ranges. It ranges so much. Some generally, but not always, smaller birds live shorter lives. Larger birds live longer lives. So birds like some albatross, these huge seabirds, they're still breeding when they're 60 or 70 years old. So they beat humans in that way. Whereas a bird like a chickadee might only live, and it should be said that the first year of life for all birds, and probably mammals too, the first year is pretty hard. They live past the first year. A bird like a chickadee can live 3 years, maybe 3 to 5 years. Certainly there's records. I think there's chickadees that have been banded you know, I don't know what the longevity record is, but I'll look it up. I'll put that in the
notes.
Put that in the notes, yeah.
The follow-up email.
Yeah.
All right. Jody and I wanted to make sure to thank you for these great presentations. Your enthusiasm and expertise has been just amazing and outstanding.
Oh, thank you.
We really appreciate it. So,
Yeah.
and we'll continue to do programming through Zoom throughout the summer at the Stillwater Library. It might not all have Joanna, unfortunately, but you can keep following up with us to see if there's any other programming that's similar. But we will send out, as you have heard us reference, last week's presentation, a link to last week's presentation, a link to this presentation, and then some of the resources that we talked about. So.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.